Welcome back. Today we are talking about Mark 4:21 through 41. This section contains some teachings by Jesus and then the story of Jesus calming the storm on the sea. Mark sets this up as the immediate successor to the previous section where Jesus is teaching by the lake shore. In the story, the way Mark is kind of constructing this section, Jesus is telling all of these parables, and Mark interjects the interpretation of the parables into the story. So, if we looked at this from a chronological perspective, Mark would be saying that Jesus gave all of these teachings, and then when Jesus and the disciples were alone, then Jesus gives all of the explanations. In the story, we are presented with Jesus giving a teaching, then an explanation, then more teaching. That's not really how that would have worked. And honestly, there's a good chance that what Mark presents as one day of teaching could have been several days of teaching. It could have been all in one day. We aren't sure, and Mark isn't trying to make the case that this was a historical day of Jesus' teaching. Rather, this is meant to be representative of Jesus' teachings. These are actual teachings from Jesus and grouped together as kind of a symbolic day, not necessarily a literal day. Where Mark was out there recording, or somebody was out there recording exactly what Jesus said on this day, but this is a representation of what a day was like for Jesus. Um, the biographies of Mark's time were not as concerned as we are with keeping things chronologically accurate as they were being representative of what it was like for the person. And so these teachings are actual teachings of Jesus. They are historical in that sense. But to say this was an exact day is probably a stretch. But let's begin with the first teaching, and that is that Jesus talks about, does anyone take a lamp and hide it under a basket or a bed? And we are familiar with this most notably from Matthew's gospel, where this idea of putting a lamp where somebody can see it is representative of the believer shining as an example of Jesus. So in Matthew's gospel, Jesus uses this analogy to say that we, as Jesus' followers, should be the light of the world. Mark's gospel, Jesus is using this same analogy, this same imagery in a different way. Again, we are not looking at, we should not be trying to read too much into this. Jesus probably used the same analogy many times and many different ways. He probably had this as a stock image in his rhetorical repertoire, where he would pull out the idea of a lamp on a lampstand, and he probably used it different ways in many different circumstances. So the fact that Mark uses this differently from Matthew should not bother us. It should remind us that Jesus is trying to tell us different things. And in this case, it is the gospel itself shines in the world so that nothing can be hidden. There is no darkness where the gospel is concerned, only light. And so we should listen to Jesus's proclamation. This has nothing to do with us shining as examples, at least not in this passage. But in Matthew it does, and that's okay. Um, there are people who try to harmonize these gospel accounts, and they do too much. They get the impression that there's one recording of Jesus' statement, or Jesus only uses a certain phrase one way, and so when the Gospels have minor tweaks to this, then there's a problem. But there's really not. Jesus spoke a lot. He probably used this many different ways. And for us, we should meditate on what it means for the gospel to be veiled in this world, and what it means for the gospel to shine forth, not just in our own lives, but on its own as its own entity, and what that means for us. Again, these parables are meant for us to meditate on, even when we have an explanation for what the parable means. It's still up to us to think about it and to meditate on it and to then take the meaning and apply it to our own lives and see how our lives interact with this parable and how we can maybe take these in a slightly different direction from what Jesus was saying, but apply them to our own situation. Um, and that comes out in some of these parables, especially where Jesus says things like the next two parables that he says, the gospel is like a mustard seed, and the gospel or the gospel is like somebody sowing seed. In the first one, the gospel is a mustard seed, as in he says it's the smallest of the seeds. Again, this is hyperbole. Um, the rhetorical flourish of the day, Jesus would have used hyperbole to exaggerate his point so that you wouldn't miss the point. And the point is that the gospel message comes in small, but then grows wildly. Um, Now, today, we have a hard time applying that the way Jesus would have, or Jesus's first disciples would have. They would have been there with Jesus in a small band, no more than 50 to 100 people who would have been Jesus's true followers, probably, possibly less. We we can see where they would have felt like Jesus was getting nowhere with his gospel proclamation. And so the idea of billions of Christians in the world would have been just nonsensical to these individuals. But for us today, who start with billions of Christians, Jesus's words here have a slightly different meaning. And we usually apply them to within an individual life or within a small community where the gospel can start out small but then take root and flourish within a person or a small community, where Jesus is looking at his initial disciples and saying, don't be so upset about the fact that there are very few of you. Recognize that this is going to take root and it's going to flourish. So when we see this message, we can apply it slightly differently, but we should still meditate on it, what it means for this small seed to grow. What does a small seed look like for us today, and where are we expecting to see this bush produce, and what are we expecting the results to be? Similar is the next passage, the next parable of the sower, where Jesus says that a person scatters seed on the ground and then goes about their lives. Obviously, farmers have other chores besides just tending to the one crop that they sowed. And that's what Jesus is highlighting, that sowing the seed, it requires patience. The farmer is going to sow the seed and then has to wait because they don't see instant results of a seed, of the plant sprouting up out of the ground. It takes time before the plant sprouts, and even after the plant sprouts, it takes time for the seed to grow and to germinate, or to germinate and then grow. What Jesus is highlighting for us is that even though the gospel message seems like it's not getting through, very often it can be working on the inside of people. So we should be patient with people. And we see this again and again, especially in maybe more charismatic or revivalist communities, where we want to judge the fruit as in how many people respond instantaneously to that message. We want instant results, instant transformation, instant 180. And that just doesn't happen in most cases. In most cases, it takes time for this gospel message to mature within people, within communities, and to grow and develop before any kind of fruit or any kind of harvest is ready. And so Jesus is here telling his disciples to be patient. And we have to acknowledge that and ask, well, what does it mean to be patient? My go-to analogy with this is that Jesus, or go-to analogy with this is in the 1800s, where this idea of instant sanctification became popular. Um, John Wesley and the Methodist movement had talked about the idea of entire sanctification or perfection, the idea that as we grow and mature with Jesus, there is a realistic possibility that we could hit a point where all of our actions are motivated by love. That is, we are not motivated by selfish desires, we are motivated by God's love in us. He said that's a reality for believers. But for him, it was very few believers who actually achieved this. And then only after years of patient spiritual discipline and meditation and working to be more like Christ. Now, that belief system got transformed in the late 1800s to you're going to come down to an altar one time after hearing a preacher and you're going to be saved or justified. And then within sometimes as little as 6 months or less, you would hear another preacher, another sermon, and this time you would come down to that same altar and you would have uh, another experience that people called entire sanctification, as in you were now complete, you were now perfect, you were now entirely given over to God. And that kind of corruption of the original message uh, really grew and prospered, especially in America in the 1800s. And it did a lot of damage to the church because people expected this instantaneous perfection of their lives, and that just wasn't what the gospel ever was meant to be. And so when I read this passage, that's what I think about. But there is also a sense in which the seed being planted means more of the community. Jesus is looking at a community where, yeah, there might be some, you plant the seed, and initially there might be some people who show some interest, but the true flourishing in the community comes later. There's a little bit of both. So again, there's no real better answer, but it should help us. The parable, the analogy, should help us think about how it can be applied to our lives and ultimately to how we see the gospel message play out in the world. After Jesus gives these statements, he then gets into a boat, and he goes to the other, or is going to the other side of the shore, or the other shore, or at least to another point on the lake. During this time, a storm blows up, and Jesus is asleep in the bottom of the boat. Now, if you are very familiar with the Bible, you are going to instantly think of Jonah chapter 1, where Jonah is the prophet who he's trying to escape God, and he goes down to the bottom of the ship and falls asleep, and the storm blows up while Jonah is asleep, and the sailors come rushing to Jonah, and they wake him up. They're frantic in this storm, and they say to Jonah, "You need to pray." And there is a lot of irony in this scene where Jonah is called to be a prophet. He's told to be a prophet, and he keeps running away from being a prophet. The prophet has to be told to pray. The prophet isn't intimately connected with God. The prophet is running away from his duty. And the sailors, in their fear, have to tell Jonah the prophet what to do. And Jonah, eventually the storm quells because they throw Jonah overboard, but Jonah does nothing to help them. Jonah's just trying to get out of the situation himself, and when Jonah is removed from the situation, the storm quells. Now, Jesus, on the other hand, he's playing clearly. This story is told in a way that is playing off that Jonah story. We are supposed to compare Jesus to Jonah in this scene. Jonah runs away from God. Jesus runs towards God. Jonah has to listen to the sailors. Jesus doesn't listen to the disciples. He takes charge. Jonah tries to run away again by being thrown overboard. Again, a close reading of Jonah shows that he's not trying to save the sailors' lives, or not necessarily trying to save the sailors' lives. He just is trying to he's trying to get away from God. So he says to them, "Throw me overboard." He doesn't say much about the sailors after that fact. It's just, this storm is here because of me. Throw me overboard. Doesn't really say that the sailors are going to experience calm. So Jonah is running away, has to listen to the sailors, doesn't really help in the situation. Jesus isn't running away. He's doing God's work. And when the disciples come to him, he doesn't have to listen to them. He just takes charge of the situation, and he tells the wind and the rain to stop. Now, it is tempting because the language is very similar to how Jesus handles demons. It's very tempting to say that the storm was demonic. That's not the case. Rather, it is just showing that, much like the demons have to obey Jesus's word because of who Jesus is, so nature also has to obey Jesus's word because of who Jesus is. That same power that can command demons also can command nature. Now, if we think about it, who is the one who can command nature? That's God. Why? Because nature is God's creation. Nature is then subservient to God. So we have to ask, who is Jesus that the wind and the waves obey him? And that's exactly what the disciples are asking, because Jesus doesn't call upon them in God's name. He doesn't, like the prophets would, say, "The Lord rebuke you," or something along those lines. He just says to them, "Peace, be still." He calms them with words not directed towards God's authority, but from his own persona, his own authority. And we have to ask, who is somebody who can direct the wind and the waves without appealing to a higher authority? Who has this kind of authority within themselves? That's what the disciples are here asking, and it's a good question to leave on. Who is Jesus that even the wind and the waves obey him? So I'm going to leave you with that. As always, if you have questions or comments, drop them here, or reach out to me in however you choose to. I'd love to deal with questions. I'd love to hear what you think about these stories and how they impact you in your world. And until we meet again, God bless.